Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into the nitty-gritty, the absolute bedrock of microbiology for anyone in healthcare. We're talking bacteria.
That's right. We're tackling that fundamental chapter structure, growth, needs, classification. It's the stuff you absolutely have to nail down to understand infections, treatments, the whole picture.
And it's got history. Way back, Van Leeuwenhoek peered through his microscope and saw these tiny animalcules, little animals.
Yeah, amazing. He saw them at all back then. But it really took Pasteur and his germ theory later on to kickstart bacteriology as a proper science.
And the relevance today is huge. The source material makes it clear it's about current issues like antibiotics, keeping hospitals clean, but also looking ahead.
Definitely. We're dealing with new threats like that nasty E. coli 0157.H7 you hear about in food recalls.
Right.
And old diseases making comebacks like plague, believe it or not. Plus, there's always the threat of bioterrorism. Knowing your bacteria is step one in defense.
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics. What are bacteria?
Okay, fundamentally, they're prokaryotic. That means no true nucleus. They're single-celled organisms, and each one is pretty much self-sufficient, capable of all life functions.
Even though they can team up in colonies or those sticky biofilms we hear about?
Exactly. They can form huge communities, but at heart, each bacterium is an independent unit. That's key.
And the classic way to start sorting them out is just by looking at them, right?
Yeah.
Their shape or morphology.
Yeah, the big three shapes. First up, cocci. These are the spherical ones, like little balls.
And they cause quite a range of problems, yeah.
Mm.
UTIs, gonorrhea, some food poisoning.
That's right. Then you've got bacilli, the rod-shaped bacteria. Think anthrax, tetanus. Many E. coli infections fall here.
And some of these rods can form endospores, those super tough survival structures.
Correct. We'll definitely circle back to those. They're incredibly important clinically.
Okay, so spheres, rods, and the third group is spirals.
Spirals, yeah. And this group has some variety. You have simple curved rods called vibrios cholera is caused by one of those. Then more rigid corkscrew shapes called spirilla. And maybe the most interesting are the spirochetes. They're thin, flexible spirals. Syphilis and Lyme disease are caused by spirochetes.
You mentioned visualizing how they move is different between spirilla and spirochetes.
Right. It's pretty cool. Spirilla often have external flagella, like little whips pushing them along. But spirochetes have something called an axial filament. It's like an internal flagellum wrapped around the cell body under an outer sheath.
So it makes the whole cell twist.
Exactly, like a corkscrew drilling through liquid. It allows them to move in viscous environments like mud or tissues.
Okay, so shape is one thing, but how they group together their arrangement, that tells us something too, right? About how they divide.
Absolutely. The pattern of cell division dictates the arrangement. If they divide and stick together in pairs, we use the prefix diplo. So diplococci are pairs of spheres.
Makes sense.
If they divide along just one axis and stay attached, they form chains. That's strepto. Think streptococci, chains of spheres.
Like strep throat.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And if they divide in multiple random planes, they form these irregular grape-like clusters. That's Staphylococcus aureus is the classic example.
Gotcha. Clusters versus chains, that seems like a really basic but important distinction in the lab.
It is, often one of the very first things you determine. There are also tetrads, groups of 4 in a square, from division in 2 planes, and sarcinae, cubes of 8, from division in 3 planes.
And the book highlights a specific one, Fusobacterium nucleatum. What's special about its shape and arrangement?
Yeah, that's a great example. It's spindle-shaped, so it's a rod, but tapered at both ends.
Okay.
And its significance, particularly in dental health, is how it arranges itself. It doesn't usually start the plaque on your teeth. Instead, it's really good at sticking to other bacteria that have already formed a biofilm.
So it's like a secondary colonizer, a dental freeloader, as the text calls it.
Kind of, yeah. It bridges other bacteria together, making the plaque structure more complex and contributing to gum disease and decay. It shows how structure and adherence are linked to disease.
It's a neat example.
Yeah.
Okay, so we know what they look like. Let's shift gears to how they multiply. Growth, right? Which in bacteria means increasing numbers.
Primarily through a process called binary fission. It sounds simple, but it's actually a really coordinated sequence of events.
Walk us through it.
Okay, so first, the single circular chromosome replicates. The cell starts to elongate, get longer. As the cell membrane grows, it helps pull the 2 identical copies of the chromosome apart towards opposite ends of the cell.
Right.
Then, a septum, a new wall, starts to form down the middle, eventually pinching off completely. And voila, you have 2 genetically identical daughter cells.
One cell becomes 2. Simple division.
Simple in concept, elegant in execution. Now, if you watch a population of these bacteria growing in, say, a test tube, a closed system where you don't add more food or remove waste,
Uh-huh.
you see a predictable pattern, the population growth curve. It has 4 distinct phases.
Okay, phase 1.
That's the lag phase. The bacteria are adjusting to the new environment. They're metabolically active, making enzymes, getting ready, but they're not actually dividing yet. Numbers aren't increasing.
Sort of gearing up.
Exactly. Then conditions are right, and they enter the logarithmic phase, or log phase, also called the exponential phase.
Because that's when the numbers really take off.
Precisely. Growth is maximal and constant. The population doubles at regular intervals. That interval is called the generation time. This is when bacteria are often most metabolically active and sometimes most susceptible to certain antibiotics that target growth processes.
But it can't go on forever in a closed tube, right? Resources run out.
Correct. That leads to the stationary phase. The growth rate slows down, and the number of new cells being produced roughly equals the number of cells dying off. Nutrients are getting scarce, and waste products are building up, becoming toxic.
So the population level kind of plateaus.
It plateaus, yeah. And finally, if conditions don't improve, the death phase kicks in. The death rate exceeds any remaining division. The number of viable cells drops significantly.
Understanding that curve seems critical for lab work, and maybe even for timing treatments.
Absolutely. Knowing which phase the bacteria are in can be very important. Now, how do we actually measure this growth in the lab?
Good question. How do you quantify cloudiness or count tiny cells?
Well, there are 2 main approaches, measuring cell mass or cell number. For mass, the quickest way is often turbidity.
That's the cloudiness you mentioned.
Yeah. You use a spectrophotometer to shine light through the liquid culture. The more bacteria, the cloudier it is, the less light gets through. It gives you an estimate of optical density, which correlates to mass. It's fast, but doesn't distinguish live from dead cells.
Okay. What about counting actual cells?
You can do direct counts using special microscope slides with grids, like a Petroff-Hauser chamber. You literally count the cells in a defined volume. Again, doesn't tell you if they're alive.
So how do you count just the living ones?
For that, you need viable counts. This usually involves diluting the sample and spreading it on an agar plate. Each living cell, in theory, grows into a visible colony that you can count. It tells you how many living reproducing cells were in the original sample.
Gotcha. Okay, so structure, growth. Now, what dictates where these bacteria can actually live and thrive? The environmental factors.
Exactly. Their requirements are incredibly diverse, which is why bacteria are found practically everywhere. Let's start with nutrition, what they eat.
Carbon and energy sources.
Right. We can classify them based on where they get their carbon and where they get their energy. Autotrophs get carbon from inorganic CO2, like plants do. Heterotrophs need organic compounds made by others.
And energy.
Phototrophs use light energy. Chemotrophs get energy from chemical compounds, either organic or inorganic.
So you combine these, photoautotrophs, chemotrophs.
Autoheterotrophs and chemoheterotrophs. And the vast majority of bacteria that cause human diseases are chemoheterotrophs.
Meaning they get both their energy and their carbon from organic molecules, like us.
Pretty much, yeah. They feed on organic matter. The example in the text about Pseudomonas growing in respiratory equipment in hospitals, that's a chemoheterotroph thriving on organic residues. They also need nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, and sometimes specific growth factors like vitamins or amino acids they can't make themselves.
Okay, nutrition is key. What about physical factors? Temperature seems like a big one.
Huge. Every bacterium has a minimum, maximum, and optimal growth temperature. We group them based on these preferences.
I know mesophiles are important for us.
Definitely. Mesophiles like moderate temperatures, optimally between about 25 and 40 degrees Celsius. Since human body temp is 37 degrees C, most human pathogens are mesophiles.
What about the extremes?
You have thermophiles, heat lovers, thriving at 45 degrees C or higher think hot springs, and psychrophiles or cryophiles, which love the cold, growing optimally near or even below freezing.
Brr. But there was another cold-related group, psychrotrophs.
Ah, yes. Psychrotrophs are actually mesophiles that can tolerate cold temperatures and grow slowly. Their optimum might be room temp, but they can still multiply in your refrigerator. They're a major cause of food spoilage.
Good to know. Okay, temperature. What else? Pressure, like salt concentration.
Osmotic pressure, yeah. Most bacteria can't handle environments much saltier than themselves, like seawater or cured meats. Water gets sucked out of the cell, causing plasmolysis, and they shrivel up.
But some specialize, right? The halophiles.
Exactly. Obligate halophiles require high salt concentrations to grow. You find them in places like the Great Salt Lake. More relevant medically are facultative halophiles. They don't need high salt, but they can tolerate it. Staphylococcus aureus is a key example. It can grow on salty skin, which gives it an advantage.
Yeah, deep sea pressure.
Yep, barophiles are adapted to the extreme hydrostatic pressure in the deep ocean trenches. Amazing stuff.
Truly. Okay, last big environmental factor.
Hmm.
Oxygen. This seems critical.
Absolutely critical. It affects metabolism, where they can live, and how we have to culture them in the lab.
So the main groups, aerobes need oxygen.
Obligate aerobes require oxygen for their metabolism.
Mhm.
They can't grow without it. Humans are obligate aerobes.
And anaerobes.
Obligate anaerobes find oxygen toxic. It kills them. They live in environments without it, like deep in soil or in parts of the gut.
What about bacteria that can swing both ways?
Those are facultative anaerobes. They can grow with or without oxygen. Usually they prefer oxygen because aerobic respiration yields more energy. But if oxygen isn't available, they can switch to anaerobic respiration or fermentation. This makes them very versatile. Many gut bacteria, like E. coli, are facultative.
Are there others? Ones that like just a little oxygen?
Yes, microaerophiles. They need oxygen, but only at low concentrations, maybe 2 to 10%, much lower than the 21% in air. Higher levels can be damaging.
And aerotolerant anaerobes.
They don't use oxygen for metabolism. They grow anaerobically, but they can tolerate its presence. It doesn't kill them like it does obligate anaerobes. And finally, capnophiles need higher concentrations of carbon dioxide than are normally present in the atmosphere.
Wow, lots of variation just around oxygen. And pH, acidity, and alkalinity.
Another key factor. Most microbes are neutrophiles, preferring a pH between 5 and 8, around neutral.
Like our blood pH.
Exactly. But then you have acidophiles, which thrive in acidic environments below pH 5.5. Helicobacter pylori, the bacterium that causes peptic ulcers, is a notable example. It survives the extreme acidity of the stomach.
How does it do that?
It produces an enzyme that neutralizes stomach acid right around it, creating a little protective microenvironment. And on the other end, alkalephiles grow best at high pH above 8.5, like in alkaline soils or soda lakes. Vibrio cholerae, the cholera bacterium, actually prefers slightly alkaline conditions.
Amazing adaptations. Okay, so with all these factors understood, how do we formally classify bacteria?
Well, historically, it was based heavily on phenotype, what they look like, morphology, gram stain, what they do biochemically. But now classification relies much more on genotype, on their genetic relationships, their evolutionary history, or phylogeny.
We still use the binomial system, right? Genus species.
Oh yes, that system from Linnaeus is still the standard. A species is generally defined as a group with similar characteristics. Within a species, you might have different strains, which are variations, and sometimes a prototype strain is designated as the reference for that species.
The text mentions Bergay's manual, the kind of Bible for bacterial classification. Has that changed too?
It has. It used to be organized purely phenotypically, but now it reflects the phylogenetic genetics-based understanding. We also distinguish between the domains Bacteria and Archaea. Archaea often live in extreme environments, think thermophiles, halophiles, methanogens, and they have key differences, like often lacking peptidoglycan in their cell walls.
Let's focus on some key medically important groups from the domain bacteria, connecting their features back to healthcare.
Okay, a really important one to grasp is the Mycoplasmas. What's unique about them?
They're tiny, and they don't have a cell wall.
Exactly. They are the smallest free-living bacteria, and crucially, no cell wall. What does that immediately tell you about treating an infection caused by Mycoplasma?
Well, antibiotics that target cell wall synthesis, like penicillin, they won't work at all.
Bingo. Their basic structure dictates treatment options right off the bat. Natural resistance.
Okay, what's another key group?
Let's talk about the facultatively anaerobic gram-negative rods. This is a huge, diverse group, often found in the intestines, the enterics. It includes E. coli.
E. coli comes up a lot. It's used in labs, but some strains are really dangerous.
Right. E. coli is like the workhorse for molecular biology research. But strains like O157H7, also known as EHC, are serious pathogens. They typically spread via contaminated food or water, often from fecal matter.
And cause bloody diarrhea. And that kidney issue, HUS.
Hemolytic uremic syndrome, yes. It can be fatal, especially in kids. Within this group, we also talk about polyforms. They're gram-negative rods. Facultative anaerobes don't form spores, and critically, they ferment lactose, producing gas. Finding coliforms, especially E. coli, in water is a key indicator of fecal contamination.
Okay, good to know for public health. What about rickettsias and chlamydias?
These guys are tiny, even smaller than some viruses. And they are generally obligate intracellular parasites.
Meaning they have to live inside a host cell to reproduce.
Correct. They can't survive long or replicate outside a host cell. Rickettsias cause diseases like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, often transmitted by ticks. Chlamydia infections, a very common STI, and also some forms of pneumonia.
Then there are the spore formers you mentioned earlier.
Yes, the endospore-forming rods. These are gram-positive rods. The two major genera are Bacillus, which is aerobic, and Clostridium, which is obligate anaerobic.
Bacillus anthracis causes anthrax, right?
It does, and Clostridium gives us tetanus, C. tetani, botulism, C. botulinum. Both produce potent neurotoxins and gas gangrene. Ciberfringens, plus C. difficile, a major cause of antibiotic-associated diarrhea. The spores are the key problem here. They are incredibly resistant to heat, drying, chemicals, radiation. Makes them hard to eliminate.
Definitely sounds tough. How about mycobacteria?
Ugh, Mycobacteria. These are aerobic rods, but they don't stain well with the gram stain. They're identified using an acid-fast stain
Why is that?
because they have a unique cell wall. It's rich in waxy lipids, particularly mycolic acids. This waxy coat makes them hard to kill with disinfectants and also confers natural resistance to many common antibiotics, again, like penicillin.
And they cause some major diseases?
Tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and leprosy, Mycobacterium leprae. Their unique cell wall makes treatment long and complex.
Okay, one last group. Streptomycetes. Are they related to Streptococcus?
Not closely, despite the similar name. Streptomycetes are actually filamentous bacteria, kind of like fungi in their growth pattern. They're mostly found in soil and are generally not pathogenic.
So why are they important medically?
Because they are prolific producers of antibiotics. A huge percentage of the antibiotics we use today, like streptomycin, tetracycline, erythromycin, were originally isolated from Streptomyces species. They're microbial chemical factories.
That's fascinating. So bacteria give us diseases, but also the tools to fight them.
In a way, yes. It underscores the complexity. Understanding these fundamental shape, growth, needs, cell wall structure, it's not just academic. It directly informs how you, as a healthcare professional, will approach diagnosis and treatment.
Right. You need to know if you should order an acid-fast stain, or if penicillin is even an option, or how long you need to autoclave something to kill potential spores. It all comes back to these basics.
Precisely. It lets you move from guessing to making informed, targeted decisions.
So to wrap up, we've covered the main bacterial shapes, the phases of growth, the diverse environmental needs, and some key medically important groups.
Yeah.
It really is the foundation.
It is. And here's a final thought to leave you with. Remember those extremophiles we talked about? The thermophiles loving boiling water, the halophiles in super salty lakes? Many of these are archaea, not bacteria, but the principle holds.
Yeah.
Scientists are harnessing the unique enzymes these organisms evolved to survive those extreme conditions. The enzyme used in PCR, the polymerase chain reaction that revolutionized molecular biology, it came from a thermophile, Thermus aquaticus. So, studying these seemingly obscure microbes living in Earth's harshest spots not only leads to biotech breakthroughs, but also informs the search for life beyond Earth in potentially extreme environments on other planets or moons. It connects lab work to, well, potentially discovering extraterrestrial life.
That's a pretty mind-blowing connection, from basic bacteria structure to searching for aliens.
Where fundamentals are always broader than you think.
Indeed. Well, thank you for guiding us through that bacterial deep dive. And thanks to all of you for listening. From everyone here at the Last Minute Lecture team, we appreciate you tuning in.